Today's video, before we get into the shenanigans, is brought to you with our long-term friends and family members at Manscaped.com, who have brought me into the world of luxury ball shaving, and they wanted me to tell you about the Performance Package Kit, which is an amazing little kit of ball shaving goodies that comes with amazing things like the Lawnmower 3.0, waterproof trimmer with advanced skin-safe technology. And I'm not doubting it by any chance. I'm actually here to really push the skin-safe because, you know, I was a man that was once scared to put razors up to my balls. Not anymore. I can actually have a lot. It's actually easy and fun with this, and that's a pretty big plus point right there. But they also wanted me to tell you it comes with things like the crop preserver and many other liquid goodies that ultimately help make your balls smell a whole lot better than they do, because we all know in the sweaty months it gets pretty bad down there. There's also the Weed Whacker nose and ear hair trimmer, which makes, ripping off those nose hairs a lot easier to do, because I remember pulling them off for job interviews. It hurts, made me cry, but not any longer with the Weed Whacker. That makes it a lot easier than you can expect. Manscaped didn't fall short about thinking about them toes, you know, those beautiful toes and those nails. You can even get their 2.0 shears for luxury nail trimming, no less. For a limited time, too, during this video, you can actually get 2 extra free gifts. For instance, you can get the travel bag, and you can get the anti-chafing boxer briefs, which actually are super comfortable. I'm wearing them right now, no joke. So let your balls and your body thank you by going to manscaped.com today and getting 20% off and free international shipping with 2 free gifts when you use promo code SOMEORDINARY at manscaped.com. Hello guys and gals, me Mutahar. I messed up recording this like 3 times, so this intro's not brand new, let me tell you. But ladies and gentlemen, you know what else is full of mistakes? My online purchase history. I tried to buy a good old-fashioned Gamecube, and they gave me this weird monolith with an X on it. You know, it's got like a little green bazooka tip at the top. I don't know what it's all about. All jokes aside, I went out and got an Xbox Series X, and it was a tough thing to find. I mean, not only are these kind of scalped where I am, but I really had to find it in the middle of nowhere in a city like mine. But I got my hands on it, and ladies and gentlemen, I realized, what if it was a GameCube? Heck, what if I could play PlayStation 2 on my Xbox Series X? Well, that's what today's video is about, ladies and gentlemen. So, for those of you who don't know, the new generations of consoles are out, and if you want to get really technical, they're almost effectively the same system. All right, you just slapped an Xbox on one side and a PlayStation on the other. They have really good CPUs, which is the focal point of today's video. They got a buttload of RAM. They got a lot of GPU space to deal with. They've got ray tracing, even though we're never going to be fucking touching that for now. These are some pretty good systems, though the Xbox has a pretty sick advantage. Now, this video is really brought to you by Modern Vintage Gamer. I gotta give him a big fucking shout out. That dude is awesome. He's a good homie. He's a good person to keep around. If you ever want to get into content that's all about emulation, which is something that I'm a huge fan of, then go to his channel, check him out. He's a really sweet dude. He makes some really kick-ass content. That guy deserves way more subscribers than he has. He basically got this all working up and setting for me. He helped me out a lot, even though I could have done this myself. However, some of the stuff included in this goes well beyond the realm of common sense. It is somewhat of a confusing mess to set this up, but let's get started with what it is. Now, first things first, we have to turn our Xbox into developer mode. So if you don't know, Xboxes, since the Xbox One, have had a feature called Dev Mode. What you basically do is you sign into your Microsoft account, you give Microsoft like $20 once. I think it's a one-time payment. I had to pay like $30 around there, and basically it allows your account to have developer privileges for Xbox. Once you do that, all you have to do is download a Dev Mode app from the Xbox's store, and then you can restart your system into developer mode. Now, developer mode basically allows you to deploy programs and actually develop right onto the Xbox One. Every Xbox One that you can buy off of the store, all the way from Xbox One to Xbox Series X, has developer mode part of it. You just have to pay to unlock it, and for the price we're paying, it's a pretty good value. Now, because developer mode is actually endorsed by Microsoft, you don't have to worry about having a special version to hack. This hack, by technicality, isn't really a hack. It's just enabling the developer feature on the system. Now, once we enable developer mode, I'm going to boot into the system and show you really quickly. It gives you this dashboard that you can basically launch things like, for example, on my screen, I have RetroArch and a File Explorer, which explores files. RetroArch is just an emulator front end that I can launch multiple emulators from. But let me show you how easy this shit is. If you go onto your computer, you can actually sign into the exact IP web portal of the Xbox One and actually install applications right now. So right here, I'm installing the PPSSPP PSP emulator. That's a weird tongue twister. What the fuck? Install that and its dependencies, and it literally takes a couple seconds, and bam! It shows up right onto the Xbox. Now, this allows you to just fire up that program, all right, and load ISOs. And in this case, I loaded up Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories. Now, a bit off topic, on topic, you can basically see the difference of why I went with the Xbox Series X. Now, because the CPUs between the Xbox Series S and the Xbox Series X are almost the same, the Xbox Series X is just clocked a little bit higher. The CPU emulating games is actually quite similar between both of them. The only real difference is because the Xbox Series X has a lot more GPU horsepower, I can actually force resolutions way higher than they're supposed to be. So for instance, in this footage of Liberty City Stories, Tony, the main character's face, looks like a fucking weird board. It just looks, there's no detail. There's nothing. The world has no detail. It's just fuzzy. And when you blow it up onto a big television, it looks bad. Now, because the Xbox Series X has horsepower, and even the S to an extent, you can actually up the resolution almost up to 10 times and just see a massive jump in visual quality. Like, this game is night and day in comparison. Now, there's an interesting feature on the Xbox Series X, or the Xbox development app, where you can actually see how much your system is being taxed. So on these graphs over here, you can see that the CPU is spiking up nominally, meaning that there is actually a lot of headroom. The more optimized and efficient these emulators become on the Xbox consoles, the better emulation you're going to get. There's a lot of overhead to deal with. The graphic processing unit is barely being taxed. Well, it's being taxed up to like, what, 30-40% of its overall capacity at 10 times the resolution on PSP at least, which is actually awesome. It means that this system, the Xbox Series X, can at least give you some really razor-sharp quality images. Now, if you're one of those people that has never really been into emulation before, emulation is a fucking great thing. It's a blessing. Emulation basically allows us to preserve older games, and not just preserve older games, but play them better than they originally could have been. And if you ever play a lot of remakes and remasters, you'll notice that developers basically just up the resolution to games and pretty much toss them out onto a disc. That's basically what you can do with emulation for free, and it's just great. It's perfect. I love it. It's why I'm a PC gamer, okay? Playing Metal Gear Solid 4 at higher resolutions than 720p, that's what I fucking live for. Now, with this said, PSP runs great, so I'm going to run down a gamut of consoles that this system can run. So NES, obviously that runs fine. Game Boy runs fine. In fact, Game Boy Advance is probably one of the best ways to play on the Xbox Series X. For instance, Castlevania is one of my favorite Game Boy Advance games ever, and the fact that it can run really smooth over here is just perfect. And given the fact that since we're using RetroArch, we have a whole list of shaders that we can actually implement and smooth out the game so it looks better on a big TV versus just really sharp, like razor sharp. Game Boy Advance runs really good. Like, this is without a doubt one of the systems that's going to support it really well. Now again, understand, this whole developer trick goes all the way back to the original Xbox One VCR model. And this shouldn't be a surprise. GBA games will run fine even on that tier. Let's move up a stage and get into like Super Nintendo. Now, Chrono Trigger is one of my favorite games, and in fact, most RPGs on the SNES is great. SNES, Super Nintendo, one of my favorite systems ever, period. RPGs are just an absolute blessing on that system. Chrono Trigger is also one of my favorite games of all time, and lo and behold, it runs really well on the Xbox Series X developer mode. Not only that, but RetroArch also comes with a lot of accuracy-based emulators, which accuracy-based emulators like Hegon, for those of you who have no idea, require a lot of processing power, but in turn, they give you a very accurate version of emulation. This means that you can play SNES games as they initially run on the SNES system. It's cycle perfect, it's accurate as hell, and there's no like, there shouldn't really be any like irregularities in emulation if you run it that way. And from what my testing has concluded, the Xbox Series X and the Xbox Series S has plenty of enough power to kind of push some of those accurate emulators out. And that's ultimately a really good thing. It means you have more choice in how you emulate those games. Sega Cd, one of my favorite systems for only one real game, and that's Snatcher. If you never played Snatcher, it's one of Kojima's different games. It's almost like it's kind of like a Telltale game. It's like just one of these like visual novel style deals, but it's super cinematic and it's super colorful, and the audio is to die for. And you want to know how it runs on the Xbox? Fucking great, dude. I mean, it sounds perfect, it looks perfect, and again, because we can save the states, we don't really have to worry about those weird Sega Cd saving issues. Dreamcast was the only system that I didn't try, simply because I don't really play a lot of Dreamcast to begin with. If all I cared about was Shenmue, which I don't, then there's a very perfectly good port on the Xbox One and PS4 that you can play if you ever fucking feel like forklift racing in your life. Now, the real meat of this experiment came down to PlayStation 1. In my opinion. PlayStation 1 is one of those emulators that, in my opinion, are some of the fucking dog shit emulators to run ever. PS1 on RetroArch has absolutely blown me away. Now, if you don't know, Sony made this piece of shit. Yeah, this little joke right here is what we call the PlayStation Classic. This is what we like to call a really like premium like coffee like coaster, if you will. I'm gonna throw that shit out there because the Xbox, bro. Baby, you bring it back, let me tell you. The Xbox actually allows you to up the resolution considerably on the Beetle PSX or Beetle PSX hardware core. Both of them are available. As long as you put a BIOS in, dumping it from a legal PS1, I hope, you can actually get higher resolutions, and if I'm not mistaken, from what I can perceive, PGXP actually seems to work. If you don't know what PGXP is, PlayStation 1 games used to have this really weird texture warping effect. Games like Metal Gear, Tomba, Scars, Ridge Racer were really notorious showing it. And because of PGXP, you can actually get a pretty smooth like rendering of the world around you. So I pretty much played through almost all of Tomba 2 on the Xbox, and I gotta say, it's playable as hell. It's one of my favorite platformers, 2.5D games on the PlayStation 1. Metal Gear Solid works as well as you can expect. Siphon Filter 2, one of my favorite games ever, works really well on this. PlayStation 1 emulation is something that, for me, PS1 was a console that I grew up with, and to have it running perfectly on the Xbox Series X, powered with its processing and the SSD, and I haven't mentioned the SSD at all, it really does impact the load times considerably for a lot of these games. I mean, games load almost snappily at this point. Now, beyond PS1, which is what you came for in this video, was good old-fashioned Gamecube. Now, Gamecube was big, so this is going to be a relatively lengthy part of the video. This is where I did a lot of my extensive testing on. Now, to begin with, Gamecube, the core we're going to be using to emulate is Dolphin. If you don't know what Dolphin is a very popular emulator for GameCube and Wii on PC. Recently, there is a core that is stable enough and very efficient running on RetroArch, and that's what we're going to be using to power these games on the Xbox Series X or S or whatever you're using. Now, this is where this is going to really separate the original Xbox One and Xbox One X line of family with the Xbox Series lineup. Now, because the CPU is redesigned in these new generation systems, you now have 8 cores and 16 threads as far as my knowledge goes, running at above 3.2 gigahertz. This is a massive step up from the really terrible CPUs we had last generation. I mean, these CPUs were like anemic laptop bargain bin trash. And if you know anything about emulation, CPUs are the most important. CPU is the most important thing required for emulation. Graphic cards are great if all you want to do is up the resolution. But if your CPU isn't able to calculate and translate all of those calls in real time, it doesn't matter how good the rest of your computer is. You will not be able to get playable frame rates if your CPU is simply not up to the task. Now, because these are 8-core, 16-threaded systems like Ryzen Bastard, Zen 2, they have plenty of processing power to run GameCube games. And I tested quite a few, some that I would consider to be real stress tests of the system. One game to start off with is Automodelista. If you've never played Automodelista, it's a very beautiful game with a cel-shaded style that actually benefits from what we're going to be doing right now. Automodelista, from a performance standpoint, runs at 60 frames per second. Now, I could enable widescreen mode, but I actually kept the letterbox because that's kind of how I play most GameCube games anyways, because it keeps that original preserved style of that game. A lot of these games typically will use widescreen hacks that almost break the UI, and you can see weird culling like issues on the side of your screen simply because the game is just hard-coded not to be running at widescreen anyways. Now, with Automodelista, you can actually see driving the car that there is a bit bit of low resolution stuff that you can spot, typically on a big television around the edges of your vehicle, and especially on texture work that is on the side of the roads. Now, because you can actually go into the settings for RetroArch, I was able to bump the resolution up 4 times to almost 4K, 2 to 4K levels of resolution. And with this resolution, the game became fucking clear. Like, we're talking really clear. Immediately, the jump from this game, it felt like it was re-released this generation of gaming. 60 frames at 4K Gamecube was a fucking dream, and that is something that validated the purchase of this console for me. I was already happy with Game Pass and the way games pretty much ran on the system, but to see Gamecube finally being perfected on a console that I could store anywhere in my house was absolutely a treat. And this is something that I cannot undersell how brilliant it is. Now, I tried other games as well too, obviously. And in the case of Gamecube, we tried Legend of Zelda. Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess was the next big game in our trial. And this is one that is my favorite Legend of Zelda game, period. I know a lot of people have Wind Waker, some people have Skyward Sword. Personally, for me, Twilight Princess is where, like, 3D Zelda really fucking peaked. And Twilight Princess at 4K runs pretty well. As far as graphical issues go, the only thing that I have spotted in my few hours of play have been some shadow issues. But as far as the game is considered, it runs really well. There is something to note, though, is the game does have stuttering issues, but I'm going to chalk that up to the fact that stuttering typically happens with these games because of shader compute. So basically, the first time you go to a new location in a lot of these video games, it's going to stutter for like half a second because it needs to calculate shaders. But once you see that area, once that hitch happened once, all right, it gets cached, it gets stored, and the next time you go there, you'll never see the hitch again. So I feel like a lot of the hitching that I saw wasn't really the fact that the SSD wasn't fast enough or the system was having an issue, because nothing in the graphs told me that. Really, all that was happening was just shader compute. So if that could ever get sorted out, it would be a far more smoother experience. But as far as my gaming went, Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess was running like butter. Now, beyond Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, I feel personally another big test in GameCube is Metroid Prime. Metroid Prime 1 or 2. So I tried 1, and I gotta be real with you, it did have way more stuttering issues, and I have to believe that was because of just shader compute. There was a moment where it just locked up for like a good second. But aside from that, it played just fine. There was no sound issues. The frame rate wasn't dipping below 60. Like, I wasn't noticing any perceptible slowdown other than those stutters that I just mentioned. The game ran smooth. I played through a few hours of the game, no crashing, no issues. And if you're wondering right now, is saving really a big deal? The saves in the game work. Save states and load states work absolutely brilliant. And it perceives its way, it actually keeps its way as you reboot and restart and do whatever you need to the console. Like, it doesn't affect in any way. One thing to note, though, the Xbox's Series S and X's quick resume feature doesn't work under developer mode, so you can't just hot swap between RetroArch or other emulators. It just simply doesn't work. Or if it does, I don't know how to activate it. Now, this is where it gets even more interesting. GameCube runs fine. The more I tested GameCube, the more I realized that it pretty much runs like a very good computer. Now it gets really good. PlayStation 2 is actually relatively playable on the Xbox Series X. Now, this is a big deal for me because Sony does not do backwards compatibility any justice. PlayStation 5 is only backwards compatible with PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 2 only to the extent of PlayStation 4 re-releases like Grand Theft Auto 3, Vice City, San Andreas, or Manhunt. Other than that, PlayStation 5 is abysmal for keeping backward support. To this day, since PS4, there is no PlayStation 3 backward support, meaning that games like Metal Gear Solid 4 will only really be preserved on PC through RPCS3. If the day ever comes that RPCS3 gets a UWP port, which is a Universal Windows-like package, I think that's the acronym. I might be completely wrong. I'll throw it up on the screen if I am. That package alone may, if it ever even gets working, which is a big if, Xbox may be able to kind of preserve it, but that's just reaching. PlayStation does not do backwards compatibility justice. The fact that you cannot run PS2 games and PS1 on PS5 is laughable. Sony has the capability. Whether they want to be consumer friendly, that's entirely up to them. Now with PlayStation 2, the core, in this case, the emulator core that we're using on the Xbox Series X is purely experimental. This is based on PCSX2, which is a very popular emulator for PC or running PS2 games. This experimental core is not intended to be playable really at all. It's really just there to experiment, to develop, and to get running. The fact that we are able to get the results that I am about to show you is kind of amazing in my opinion. So let's get started. Immediately, as soon as I started the PS2 emulator, I had to run Metal Gear Solid 2 Subsistence. As far as I know, Metal Gear Solid 2 is one of the most demanding games on the PS2. And as far as its performance goes on Xbox Series X, it's great. And remember, performance in terms of how fast it's running will actually be relatively similar in almost every case to the cheaper Xbox Series S. So if you don't want to spend Xbox Series X money, because hey, money is kind of tight right now, Xbox Series S is relatively a good value, very cheap. It's probably the best value you're going to get, $299, to run these kind of emulators at this capacity. The only time the game really slowed down was during the Olga boss battle, and I have to believe this had something to do with the original PlayStation 2 as well. There might have been something slowing down on that. Again, I haven't played Metal Gear Solid 2 on the original PlayStation 2 hardware in like over a decade. The majority of my playthroughs have honestly been on the HD collection, and you may wonder, now that I've said that, what the fuck is the point of emulating MGS2 on Xbox Series X? Well, there's two reasons, okay? I know the HD collection exists, and it's probably better in a lot of ways, but it isn't, because the original PS2 version has fucking snakeboarding, and because I wanted to emulate the PS2 version. Now, because we're on the Series X, I was able to get to resolutions at around 4K, so the game was looking really sharp. In fact, I would dare to say even sharper than the HD collection, simply because I was pushing for a resolution beyond 1080p, and I was able to get it. So, honestly, as far as PS2 emulation goes, it's impressive. But then we only get deeper. Now, if you ever heard of a game called SOCOM, it's a great tactical shooter that was created by Sony. They made one really shitty game called SOCOM 4, and I guess Sony decided, nobody's interested in SOCOM. No, sweetie, we're not interested in shitty fucking games. We're interested in SOCOM 1 to 3. You can play SOCOM 1 on a good old X-Cube right here. Let me tell you, it runs relatively well. Like, it is smooth. There is some slight input lag, but that input lag actually existed on the original PlayStation 2 anyway, so I'm not going to chalk that as a negative for the Xbox. I was able to get resolutions of, again, 4K, so not only is the game running like it did on the PS2, but it's also running crisper, way crisper than it did on the PS2. And I want to assume that as this core matures and we get closer to a release, because this needs to rise in popularity, maybe the day might come that netplay will get implemented. And if you don't know what netplay is, SOCOM multiplayer was some of the best times in the world. In fact, PS2 multiplayer, in my opinion, was a good time, was a very good time. And if netplay gets introduced to RetroArch's PS2 core sometime in the future, then you might be able to see a resurgence of PlayStation 2 multiplayer classics delivered to you on the Xbox. That is a weird thought, but it is a possible thought. Now again, PS2 got me even more hot and bothered, so I decided to test some more games. Deus Ex: The Conspiracy. Yes, they once made a Deus Ex port for the PlayStation 2. Is it good? Yes and no. I will say in some ways Deus Ex for the PS2 has some superior visuals, but superior visuals don't really matter when you completely fuck up the gameplay. It's a very restricted version of the PC version of Deus Ex. There's not a whole lot of openness. The mission design is a joke, but I just wanted to test the visuals. And may I remind you that this game, as far as I know, isn't really like one to be tested on PCSX2. So the fact that it's running as good as it did was a shocker to me too. But this was the first game that I started to play where the graphical glitches started to really manifest. See, as soon as you get onto Liberty Island, the first section, there is a loading screen between the statue section and the introductory dock section. See, everything on the dock looks fine. There's no visual problems. As soon as you load into another area, the ground starts to go red for some reason. I guess maybe it's some weird shading issue regarding the game and it's loading in certain textures, but it's very prominent and it only starts to get worse as time goes on. And I initially thought maybe if you keep saving and reloading the game, it might fix it. But in my case, it really didn't do anything. For some reason, this just permeated through the entire game. So this was, without a doubt, the one game on the PS2 experimental core. And again, I want to stress the fact, this is an experimental core, meaning it's still working its kinks out. It started to give me some issues. So, that wasn't the only last game we wanted to test. I wanted to try Persona 3, FES. Persona 3 is a really good RPG. It's a very long RPG, but it's got probably one of the best stories in Persona history out there. I wanted to run it on this emulator to see how it would run, and the performance was not only great, but this is another game that didn't have any real graphical issues manifest on me, at least in my time of play. Now, again, with updates, things can break, so as of now, Persona 3 FES runs like a dream. But not only does it run like a dream, it really highlights what emulation can do. See, earlier throughout this entire deal, every bit of footage that I'm showing you has had its resolution bumped up in some way. Because I'm using the Series X, I'm not slouching on how much resolution bumps that I can do. And in most of these games, I'm running at a resolution of around 4K. This really adds a lot of definition that was missing from the original PS2 version anyways. For example, you can actually see Mitsuru's face in the 3D element of the gameplay instead of just the 2D artwork. It actually adds a level of, it almost feels like you're playing a remaster of a great game versus just the original PS2 copy. And again, with the added benefits of smoother frame rates and just faster loading times because of the built-in SSD, this is probably going to be a de facto way of me playing PS2 games as this core matures. Now, I'm going to say this much, it's not easy to get this running, and allow me to explain something right now. It's almost not even worth it. PS2, at least in general, requires you to install a very specific version of RetroArch. It requires you to have a very specific placement of files, one that me and MVG had to talk about for a little bit. I think around an hour, we were kind of discussing how we had to get this stuff running. This is not the easiest system to start completely emulating on. For instance, GL, which is OpenGL, the graphic library, seems to have a lot of issues running on the Xbox Series X or the S. You have to manually constantly go into the video settings and put these games forcibly into DirectX 11 mode, which is what the Xbox Series X can support. Normally, it can go all the way up to DirectX 12, but RetroArch doesn't really give me support for that anyways. But you need to make sure DX11 is enabled. You also need to make sure your games are running on the internal SSDs. I've typically been using external drives to run a lot of games from the SNES, Sega CD, even the PS1 era, but as soon as you start moving up to Gamecube and PlayStation 2, for some reason, the cores do not support external drives. So you need to make sure when you set this thing into developer mode, it has enough space to store a few PlayStation 2 and GameCube games, and then, and only then, are you going to have somewhat of a plausible time. Without running games off of the internal SSD of the Xbox Series X or S, you're going to have a terrible time getting into the boot. Otherwise, it's going to take like 5 minutes for you to ever even get into a game. Like, it takes literally that long to boot, and it's an absurd amount of time. I don't know why it is, but it just tends to happen. So that's pretty much one of the gotchas of this system. So yeah, emulation is pretty good, I would say. Whether you have an Xbox Series S or an X, I would say that the CPU is, since it's effectively the same, you're going to be able to get playable resolutions at native. And even if you have the Series S, I think you have enough GPU headroom to push at least 1080p on a lot of games. So it's not like they're going to look bad on the Series S. It's just that with the Series X, you'll be able to get even higher resolutions and potentially put in some even beefier shaders because you have the extra graphic horsepower. But what's negative about this situation, and there are a couple negatives, and I have to stress these very heavily. You can only emulate or play Xbox games on this at any given moment. See, to go into developer mode, you effectively have to separate yourself from the actual main games that you own. So let's say that you're playing Forza Horizon 4, which looks absolutely beautiful on the Xbox Series X, and you want to say, I want to emulate some Zelda. Well, you're going to have to enter developer mode, and to switch back and forth between retail mode, which is where you play all your like own games like Cyberpunk or Forza or Gears of War or Halo, and developer mode, which is where you emulate, it takes like 5 to 10 minutes, man, even a little bit, like 15 minutes sometimes, to switch between those modes. I think it's re-imaging the entire operating system that it's booting from as you switch back and forth, and there are even more caveats with that. Xbox One X and S have Xbox Series X and S, terrible naming scheme again, actually have a feature called Quick Resume or Quick Suspend that I really enjoy. because these systems utilize virtual machine technology, they really just suspend video games and applications to memory and store them in like blocks of 10. So you can rotate between 10 games and load them within like 3 or 4 seconds. It's actually really, really sweet. Like it almost just makes you switch games on the fly because you can. If you keep switching between retail and developer mode, the Xbox will actually wipe the quick resume feature. So if you rely on that, you better start saving your games and really commit to finishing games in the emulator side or not, because unless you want to deal with 10-minute long boot times between each system, then that's pretty much where it's at, ladies and gentlemen. But aside from that, there really isn't a big negative caveat that I found with this situation. It's a really good emulator box, and heck, if you honestly just want an Xbox to emulate, maybe picking up a cheaper Xbox Series S down the line when they're in stock and readily available might not be such a bad option. You know, buy developer mode, slap it onto the Xbox Series S and stick it somewhere under a television, and you'll have one of the best emulator boxes, period, bang for your buck, out there. And that's something that I have to give up for the Xbox. It ended up becoming the one system that, in my opinion, even though that I'm a PlayStation gamer, now we're towards the end of the video, I'm a PS gamer. I'm a PlayStation guy at the end of the day, but I have to say, if I didn't have any biases going before this, I'd probably end up getting an Xbox Series X if I had to pick between one system. And that's solely because I personally believe in my hours of play with both systems for over a month at this point, that the Xbox is not only giving me better load times, but better frame rates and overall better compatibility and better just a better experience with the multi-platform games. But now when you add the fact that emulation is so strong on these boxes, and even though they're not officially supported, Microsoft isn't stepping on anybody's toes for doing this, at least as far as I've seen, that it adds way more value. It reminds me of when I made that video where Xbox should have had a separate Windows 10 partition for you to install your Windows 10 operating system and game off of. Honestly, if Microsoft does that a year down the road and literally allows you to use Windows 10 on the box, this feature is only going to get way more easier as time comes on. Because at that point, they'll have you opened up to things like RPCS3 or whatever. And if that ever happens, boy, am I going to be making a follow-up of a fucking video to this. But ladies and gentlemen, that was turning my Xbox into a Gamecube, PlayStation 2. I don't even know how I'm going to title this bad boy. But all I know is I got to have a really good time flexing the good old tech muscle, running good old emulators on the Xbox monolith, and that's probably what the name should have been for this, in my opinion. But overall, I gotta say, I'm very fucking impressed, man. I'm really happy to see this kind of, preservation exist on a modern home console like this. Because at the end of the day, emulation is something that I live for. Emulation is something to me that is very important. It's why I'm a PC gamer. I'm not a PC gamer because I care necessarily about getting higher resolutions and frame rates on modern AAA games. I don't care. I'm a PC gamer because I know that game preservation is important. We need to preserve the video games throughout history. And the only way we're going to be doing that is with emulation. And because the Xbox is a very popular console, and it's going to be the one console that really allows this readily for a lot of home users that don't have fast computers anyways, this is something really interesting and super awesome to see. So again, long live emulation, and congratulations, Xbox, because this is a pretty genuinely impressive feature, even if it was pretty unintended. But yeah, that said, ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it. I am out.